Hey everybody, it's Christina from Creations with Christina and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be making 3 cards using 1 stamp set and 1 die. I pulled out this 6x6 paper pad by DCWV. It's called Sweet and Sassy and has some really cute, adorable colors in it. I picked out 2 shades of pink and I'm going to go ahead and die cut this using my all-time favorite dies by Simon Says Stamp. They're the stitched rectangle dies and I'm using the largest die in that set to create one of my matte layers to my card. I die cut this on my Gemini Junior and just used some of my purple tape to keep it in place. I'm going to pull out my Heart Filigree die from Simon Says Stamp. This is a brand new die that just recently came out in their release. And I'm going to die cut that right into the center of that rectangle that I just die cut out of the pink paper. One of the easiest ways to clean up your dies and get all those little tiny pieces, especially with a very intricate die, is to use this little brush set from Sizzix. It makes getting all those little tiny die cut pieces out so much easier. I'm taking the pink paper. It's got a little bit of a stripe to it. In hindsight, I probably didn't need to use the striped paper. I could have just used a solid color paper, but I cut that down so that I knew it would cover up the back part of that little die cut piece. I added some adhesive to the back of my piece of pattern paper that I die cut the filigree heart from and ran my tape runner over it, and I used the dotted adhesive so that I could just wipe away whatever got stuck on my surface and I didn't have to worry about trying to use a liquid adhesive to get all those little detailed spots. I'm using a piece of vellum for my sentiment. I cut it down to 8.5 by 1.5 inches. And I'm going to use my Tim Holtz. I'm using both my Tim Holtz and my MISTI in today's video. I needed a larger stamped platform for my sentiment for this card because of using the longer piece of cardstock, and my MISTI is a mini MISTI and I couldn't, fit that in there without creating any little creases or whatever in my vellum. I'm taking my sentiment. It's Hello Sunshine. It's from the Buttercup Simon Says stamp set that just also was recently released. And I'm adding that to my platform. Now I used a whole bunch of my magnets that I had around because the vellum kept slipping on the cardstock, and as you can see I touched it twice and had to reapply my embossing buddy powder so that I can get the static and any of my oils for my hands, and it would allow that only the embossing powder will only stick to the Versamark ink that I used to stamp out my sentiment. I just put down a piece of scrap paper so I can add my white embossing powder. I'm just using the Hero Arts ultrafine embossing powder for the sentiment. And I'm going to heat emboss this using my heat gun. Now I did heat it up before I started to run it on my vellum, and you have to be very careful with vellum because you don't want to burn your vellum. So you can see I'm kind of pulling it away from the vellum every couple seconds just so I don't burn it. Once that's embossed, I added some foam adhesive to the back of my panel, and I'm going to take my vellum and wrap it around. Now I like to put my foam adhesive on first so that my vellum has something to stick to while I'm trying to fiddle around with the other side and make sure it's straight. Once I have that done, I did go ahead and add a little bit of extra adhesive to the vellum, and then I'm going to put this onto a piece of Nina 110-pound cardstock that I cut down to my card base, which is a standard A2 size card as a top fold. I used May Arts Twine to create a little wraparound section on my vellum, and I'm just going to go ahead and tie that into a bow to kind of finish off and give a little extra texture to my card. Now that I struggled with tying my little bow, I'm going to go ahead and add my final touch to my card. I'm using the Multi-Matte Medium adhesive by Ranger. I love this adhesive because it does dry clear and matte. So if you're using something like clear gems like I'm using today, these are gems by Lucy's Cards. They're the ice, I think it's called the Ice Cube Mix. And I'm just sprinkling a couple of these onto my card. But what's really nice is if you put too much adhesive on and it kind of comes out from underneath your gem, when it dries, you're not even going to see it because it blends in, and because it dries matte, you don't even notice that it's there. So this finishes our first card. Here are a few pictures of how our card turned out. Our next card, I'm going to be using this 6x6 paper pad by Echo Park called Home Sweet Home. And I love the colors in this pad. I picked out the piece of pattern paper that has the mini strawberries on it, as well as this other piece that has like a worn piece of paper. I took the stitched rectangle die set, also from Simon Says Stamp, and die cut my 2 pieces of pattern paper with my Gemini Junior. I was more worried about my top layer, which is the one that looked like the older piece of paper, making sure that the stitched lines were nice and clear in the front. But that bottom piece was just going to be my background, and it didn't really matter to me if it didn't have the perfect stitched lines. Using the filigree heart, I went ahead and die cut that 3 times onto that piece of worn looking piece of paper. I didn't bother taking out all those little pieces of the die cut pieces that are left inside the die until I was all done. And I didn't really have to worry because it did die cut each time perfectly. That little Sizzix tool is the handiest thing for getting all those little die pieces out. I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiment. I apologize, I'm off screen a little bit, but I will fix that here in a second. I am adding my die cut piece of pattern paper to my mini MISTI, and I'm going to stamp out my sentiment. I'm using the Happy and the Birthday from the BUTTERCUP stamp set. I'm just laying them out. What I love about the MISTI or any kind of stamping tool is how easy it is to lay your stamped images or your sentiments onto your cardstock so you know you're always getting it straight, and being able to stamp out your images and your stamps perfectly, because even if you don't get a crisp stamp the first time, you can stamp it again. I'm using Papertrey Ink's Cocoa Bean ink, and it is a dye-based ink, so once it dries it does lighten up in color, so I went ahead and stamped it out twice so I can keep that nice brown tone to the image. We're going to go ahead and start putting together our 2 pieces of pattern paper. I'm just using my dotted tape runner again and adding some adhesive to the back of my front layer of my cardstock. I just have to be very careful in the one corner where I die cut, because I did die cut there, so it's not as stable. I like to line my pattern paper up in a corner and then just go right up the side so that I know that I'm always straight and my pattern paper is lining up. My card base is a piece of Kraft cardstock. It's cut at 4 1/4 by 11, and using my Score Buddy, I scored it at 5 1/2. I'm running out of foam adhesive, so I decided to use some fun foam for the back of my card. I die cut this also using the same stitched rectangle die that I did with the front 2 pieces, but it did, when it runs through the machine, it did stretch out a little bit, so it was a little bit off and sticking out on the side. So I just took my scissors and just trimmed those right off. And because I took the adhesive side of my fun foam and stuck it to my pattern paper, I need to add adhesive to the back of the fun foam. So I'm just using my Nouveau Deluxe adhesive, which is a fantastic strong holding adhesive, and just added that to the fun foam and then added that to my card base. And because I can't get enough of the Ice Cube Gems by Lucy Cards, I did go ahead and add some more of those onto this card as well. Again, using my multi-matte adhesive, I did sprinkle them in various places throughout my card. I like to use my little silhouette pick-me-up tool. You can also use a jewelry tool for picking up beads. I have this on hand and use this for picking up all those little tiny pieces. I like to add a little extra texture to my cards, so I'm taking my May Arts twine, this is the natural twine, and adding a little bow to the front of my card. Again, using the multi-matte medium so that when it dries in a matte finish and you won't see the glossy part of that. I went ahead and glued down my little bow. Just to keep it in place while the glue dried, I took one of my acrylic stamp blocks and set it on top. The last thing we need to do is just trim off our little tails, and that's our second card. It's all finished. For our last card, we're going to be using the 6x6 paper pad by Echo Park called Teacher's Pet. I pulled out a piece of scrap that was in there, as well as a little text piece that we're going to be using. And then also pulled over the piece of scrap that was left over from our previous card to create a little bar for my sentiment. Using the gray cardstock, I had originally planned on this card to be a landscape card, but when I cut my sentiment piece, my sentiment bar for my card, I wanted to do it in portrait and did it the wrong way. So I had to do a little modification on my card. I took my gray piece and cut it out with a part of the rectangle die and made this into a square just by recutting again a second time to make it into a square piece. Now, I could have probably pulled out my stitched square dies that I'm sure I have somewhere in my stash, but my rectangles were out there and I just modified to use them up. I'm going to take my filigree heart and die cut that right into the center of that piece of gray cardstock. And once I've done that, I'm then going to go ahead and take my pattern paper, the piece of text paper that was left, and cut that down to be a mat underneath that heart. Now, I wanted to make sure that the text was the only thing poking through and not any of those little images, so I lined that up onto that piece of cardstock and just use my scissors to cut around and create that back piece. To add a little bit of texture or dimension or character to that little filigree heart, I went ahead and added some ink to the edges to darken it up with some VersaFine Black Onyx ink. I also wanted to add a little bit of something else to it by kind of flicking some white acrylic paint onto that piece. So while that's drying, I'm going to set it aside and I'm going to start working on our sentiment. Again, I'm using my mini MISTI to stamp out my sentiment. Absolutely love the magnets that are in this, the MISTI. They're very strong. I did go ahead and purchase the bar to this as well. So I'm just right now trying to figure out how to best put the bars so that it's not in the way while I'm trying to stamp out my sentiment. So I selected the Love Sentiment from the Buttercup stamp set and lined that up inside of my MISTI. And then I'm going to stamp this out using the VersaFine Black Onyx ink. I love this ink. This is absolutely my favorite black ink that I use for stamping sentiments. Generally, I only have to stamp it out once, and it gives a nice, crisp, clear sentiment for you. This card was one problem after another because of first die cutting my sentiments block the wrong way. I then found out later on as I was putting my card together that my piece of black cardstock that I pulled out was not a full 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I just assumed it was because it was in my drawer where I keep all of my cut pieces. But it worked out in the end, you'll see. I did go ahead and mat my filigree heart with the text paper and then also adhered down my Love Sentiment. And what I love about this adhesive is that it doesn't stick permanently right away. So if you put it on crooked like I did, you can then pull it off and just realign it, and it gives you a little bit of wiggle room for getting that sentiment stuck on there. It will become a permanent after it's set for a little bit. So I went ahead and added the filigree heart matte piece that I die cut, and I probably should have mounted this piece onto my card base before putting my gems on, but I didn't. I went ahead and added my gems. I'm using some more of the Lucy Cards gems. They're not the ice box ones. It's actually, they're called Raindrops, and they're a clear, smooth versus the icebox ones, which have kind of like a diamond cut to it. They've got little edges to it. I added that using my multi-matte medium, and then adhered this down to my card front, which is a piece of cream cardstock from Simon Says Stamp. So this is our final card in our video. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you're new. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next video.